Hi, welcome to the News at Gen for Monday, April 5th, 2021. You might notice today's episode is a little different in that I want to look into a specific area a little deeper. Transgender people in sports, and specifically recent laws aimed at trans youth. In case it's not clear from my everything, I really don't care about sports. I mean, I used to lift weights, but it was because I was trying to compensate for something. The inability to lift weight. I like being strong. But while I may be able to intellectually understand why someone might like a solitary sport, and I'd recommend Iron and the Soul by Henry Rollins, if anyone is interested in why I cared for that particular sport. Team sports leaves me confused and disoriented. But that's not for me. That doesn't mean it's not for anyone else. I'm far too old to care about how other people spend their free time. But before we begin, I want to give you a few things up front. Number one, obviously I have a bias. As I draft this introduction, and before I do any research, I want trans kids and young adults to be able to play sports as their actual gender. That means trans girls play with other girls, and trans men play with other men, and so on. And because I have a bias, I cannot and will not be able to overcome that bias without conscientious effort, which means I'll have to take arguments as they come, not how I would like them to, or from whom I would like them to. Yeah. Because I have a bias, I must be super diligent about the whole anyone who disagrees with me is a transphobe thing. That may and will likely be true, but that's not a counter argument, is it? Unfortunately not. Number four, because America, this will overlap with discussions of bills that deny medical care to trans kids. Matter of fact, there's going to be a very specific section all about that. So, number five, because America, there will also be overlap with discussions who look to deny rights to adults. So there'll be a little bit less of that. But because of the above, I cannot pretend that cis people give a shit. And number seven, because life, this whole episode has a giant blinking, klaxon bleeding trigger warning for transphobia. Also, I show a picture of some blood, which I note before that shows up. You ready? No? Well, let's do it anyway. The year 1975. Rocky Horror, Dog Day Afternoon, and the Apple Dumpling Gang were in the theaters. But the Apple Dumpling Gang wasn't all that was signaling a change. Tennis player Renee Richards was transitioning. She underwent gender reassignment therapy, and the next year she started playing other women under a pseudonym. You see, when you transitioned back then, what you would do is you would quit your job, left everyone, and people thought you died. That's what happened. But Richards still played tennis because people who play tennis are weird. It's a tennis thing. I can't explain it. So Richards went back to tennis, and when a journalist saw her, he was impressed with her abilities and decided to do a little digging and maybe a little story. A feel-good story, like they do. But he discovered Richards' history. Yep, she was trans. As an aside, that journalist was Tucker Carlson's dad, Richard Dick Carlson. So, the association in charge of tennis players in the professional level instituted a chromosome test, presuming all women were XX and of course men are all XY. Of course, we know that's not true, and we knew then too. There are a handful of reasons that might be scrolling by if I remember to do that. It's awfully cold out here. They also knew that chromosomes weren't necessarily destiny. But people are loath to forget the two things that they learned in high school biology, the XY-XX dichotomy, and that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. This wasn't new at the time either. Several other organizations, including the Olympics, used the same tests, out of transphobic habit. Fear, whatever. Of course, this is part of the narrative, even now. In 2006, a scholar named Heather Sykes called this an unfair advantage discourse, which, according to her, contains three key assumptions. Testosterone leads to athletic success. Men are better than women in athletics, and men will do the whole fillet of phallus things to reap the benefits. And I will say, none of these are true independently, and even if one were, not all of them are. This is clear because of the lack of dominance in sport by trans women. In a couple words, we suck. Richards herself lost to a 17-year-old woman in a tournament. Many people started to wonder what all the fuss was about trans women. And finally, after suing for access, she did make it to the US Open in 1977. She lost in the first round, not a promising development for her career. Now, some people weren't happy, including Gloria Steinem. She had some choice things to say about Richards. Of course, sometimes people change their mind. 20 years later, as is tradition, some things have stayed the same. In 2004, the Olympics, though, began to allow trans athletes if surgery, hormones, and legal recognition had been completed. Before that, though, they found no trans people were hiding. Oh, they did find several intersex people, and that fucked their lives up. Not because being intersex is bad, but because it's derailed their athletic opportunities. Because, if you've put enough into the sport to be good at it, you probably put some time into it instead of, accounting. Now, it would be unfair to leave the story there. Because in 2007, Richards responded to the 2004 change. She said, not think trans women shall participate in sports because apparently that's because trans women have an advantage for sports. And sports are for guys. Nobody's perfect. But the transphobic tradition is a hard one to break, especially for someone in their 60s. To this date, no trans people, no trans women have qualified the Olympics, even after standards were further loosened in 2016. One did try out and compete in the 2020 Olympic time trials, but his name was Chris Mosier. For the record, a trans guy. Now, Caster Semenya, who won a gold in 2016, is intersexed. Now, I'm not going to discuss that. It's a whole nother thing, and I'm already going way too long here, and it's cold out, as I've said. But she's one of those people that had some rather significant obstacles in her life, and now drugs are being asked of her to further repress her natural testosterone. And, of course, there's Fallon Fox, an MMA fighter. She was criticized for breaking the orbital bone of her opponent during a match. A mixed martial arts match where breaking bones is a relatively common injury. The orbital bone itself was every few months in a general sense. Now, was this fight within the typical bell curve of brutality during an MMA match? Well, it appears so. Her opponent, Erica Newsom, claimed that Fox had a different kind of strength. Is that true? Or is she making excuses for poor performance? She's only fought twice as a pro and lost both times. I don't know. I wasn't there. I haven't watched the fight because it doesn't interest me in a general sense. I find MMA to be interesting only in a theoretical sense. In fact, Fox took Newsom in 39 seconds, but Newsom lost 8 months prior in 36 seconds to a cisgendered woman. So Fox was slower? And if you're thinking about this photo of Kay Henson, which is a bloody sight in any world, well, the thing is, Fox never fought Henson. Or Hansen. That was against Cal Schwartz. Fox lost her fourth bout to Ashley Evans-Smith. And Ashley's a cis person. So when Fox retired, her record wasn't even near championship levels. Now, I don't know. I have strange feelings about UFC MMA as a sport. I know that's not a good thing to say. I actually debated with myself if I should just avoid her, but I really can't. Is it okay if I punt on contact sports? It seems kind of cowardly. She still failed to dominate the sport. I can't get around that fact either. But I can't get around the fact that I don't like it. I don't care about her. But some things are less painfully brutal. In fact, the most prominent trans woman who has won a major tournament is Veronica Ivy, then known as Rachel McKinnon. She won a gold in cycling for her age bracket. In fact, she beat a person, Jennifer Wagner, who Ivy had lost to 3 times. I mean, if trans people compete, sometimes trans people will win. Instead of congratulations, though, she got attacked by Donald Trump Jr. for her troubles. Disclosure notice. On the day of this writing, Veronica Ivy and I follow each other on Twitter. But there actually remains very little to no actual dominance of professional sport by trans women. Those champs do not exist, and to put it bluntly, there's at least 40 plus years of athletics to attest to that. No, I didn't buy this. I found it. Part of the problem is that research into trans people's bodies is so rare. I mean, we've had some, but some people burned those books. Those people were Nazis. Stupid Nazis ruined everything. Anyway, but that was like a while ago. I like to think that I'm a rational person. So what does science currently say? Last year, an article appeared in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. The baseline was that trans women had a 9% advantage of running speed after 1 year of testosterone suppression. Trans men rapidly improved their performance. Many current athletic organizations call for 1 year of therapy before people can play competitively. Okay, so we learned something that we don't know much. We learned that people in the Air Force have these effects. The authors say at the beginning that the testosterone is responsible for athletic performance, but that could be wrong, and they admit as such. The conceptual model for our multivariable analysis could be wrong and incorrectly estimate the relationship of testosterone or estrogen with changes in athletic performance. Finally, testosterone and estrogen protocols were not standardized for our participants. They also didn't, it just upsets me because they didn't control or even monitor hormone levels or exercise regimen for this study. Nor was there a real control group of cis people. There was a theoretical control line, but no group that was measured alongside these people. But the study has its problems, and the results are very inconclusive. All this study, like many studies, suggest is more studies. Fine. But let's take the results as they are. Maybe there is something there. Trans women appear to have an advantage in strength for a time after transitioning. I don't think that was up for debate. I think that was plainly obvious. Now, as a trans person, I seem to have noticed that it takes a few years to really get the full effect of HRT. So 1 year might not be enough. But again, it's not definitive. Maybe 1 year isn't enough, and I know that's not exactly going to win me accolades, but we also know that it's not 100%. Maybe it's 2 years. Maybe it's a case-by-case basis. We don't know. We don't know because this study wasn't complete and thorough, and it was fine for what it was. But it wasn't enough. What is enough? We'll have to see. But that one wasn't. It just lacked some very basic experimental controls. I do know that the straw trans woman argument of the guy changing gender and hopping into the MMA octagon and beat up the shit out of women isn't a thing that happens. But there is one thing, that the study was done on adults. And the study's authors specifically say they really don't know about kids. They say, quote, "It is possible that these results could be different among trans women who begin gender-affirming hormone therapy shortly after the onset of puberty and never experience the ergogenic benefits of testosterone exposure." So, adults are adults. And with our own concerns, and dare I say, we're also important. But this is a discussion we can have. But we have some time. Trans kids don't as much. Trans kids are also undergoing hormones, and those effects aren't instant either. but the current raft of anti-trans bills are aimed squarely at children. So let's think about the children. So what's the law? Well, if they have everything going for it, more than half the United States, 28 of them, 28 of our states, are currently pondered or have recently enacted anti-trans kid legislation. And that's what they are. Let's not beat around the bush. They're not for cis people. They're for anti-trans kid. So let me change focus right now to trans child medical care, because those and athletics in these circumstances are related. Remember that line, never experienced the ergogenic benefits of testosterone exposure? Quite clearly, if we want to have fair sports for both girls and cis girls, we need to look into that. While a bunch of places have proposed a veritable horde of anti-trans kid athlete legislation, these kids have anti-trans kid health care. These states are Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kansas, Kentucky, Missouri, Montana, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, Utah, West Virginia. And if you count the one that I got out of order, I'll be very excited to see that you actually paid attention. Now, some of these laws have cute titles like the Arkansas Save Adolescents from Experimentation Act, or SAFE, which oddly will make Arkansas less safe when kids kill themselves because they cannot get the treatment doctors have said that they need. And that's rough. I know that's rough. That's a rough call. So right now I'm going to show you a picture of a cute animal. Very cute. Back to torturing trans kids, which is what they want to do. What these bills do is multiply wrong on several levels. It's like an exponential amount of bullshit. They insist that being trans is bad. But it's not. Rhetorically, that's what these bills are. They're saying, well, trans is dangerous, so I must protect our kids from this. Rhetorically, these bills say trans people aren't as good as cis people, or as natural, which is demonstrably wrong, not only philosophically, but archaeologically too. They ignore tested science. Seriously, puberty blockers block puberty. There are cases in the literature as far back as 1982, and then more adolescents in 1988. And these kids are now my age. They're doing good. And that's not even talking about cases of precocious puberty, which date back even a decade before that. Seriously, 30 years after Einstein published his article on relativity in 1915, we had the atomic bomb. Okay, it's not the best metaphor, but as an example of science and how it can be built and shown to be true over decades, that's pretty damn good. Kids taking puberty blockers is evidence-based best practice. This claim is that they're experimental is simply a fucking lie. Furthermore, even intellectually, do you know when puberty onset is? 8 to 14. Mostly. Not always. Yeah, that's right. You don't. It's not a quinceañera or a bar mitzvah or getting a driver's license. It's different for everyone. There's a huge range, and that's all normal. A kid who starts puberty at 12 could have precious years to ensure they are who they say they are. When kids go on puberty blockers, they get time, not surgery. But let's go back even younger. Like kids. You know what best practices are, according to most psychologists, for a trans kid before puberty? Calling the kid their chosen name and pronouns, as well as letting them dress and act like they are, because it doesn't fucking matter. Puberty blockers are used to give children more time. All of our cells are equipped to respond to hormones. Either one. Any of them. Feel my skin. No, don't, please. Because you're in the camera. You can't do that. They all respond. We all have the ability to go either way in a binary system. And it's not binary. The only thing that can tell a child what the child is the child's mind. And once puberty blockers are stopped, fertility rates return to the baseline. Fertility rates, which is what most people talk about. These things, the side effects, are mostly focused around bone density, fair, and the ability of trans kids to have kids, which is a little weird. We're talking about these kids popping out kids as if we know that that's going to happen anyway. Not to mention, as if we need more kids. But regardless, people who protest treating trans kids as trans center cisgender people, not the kid. The society would deem that what the kid is lesser. The trans is worse when it's not. So what's the balance here? Is it a 0.1% loss of bone density, or years of dysphoria, suicidal ideation, and execution? If a trans kid does make it through, potentially thousands of dollars in costs in an attempt to undo a puberty which could have been prevented by a pill in the first place. Let me wade a little further into where I have no experience because I've already gone this far. Let me remind you that I am not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not your lawyer, but it reads to me like the outlawing of puberty blockers causes direct harm to trans children. And we're not talking about such pithy things as psychological harm, though, to be clear, psychological harm too. Cis puberty has cost me money. This has had a direct impact on my financial well-being. Certain things about my body could have been avoided if I had known what I was and been treated early enough. I'm talking about secondary sex characteristics. What do you think? Boobs grow on trees? Am I saying trans kids' parents should sue Arkansas? Again, I'm not a lawyer, but it's clear from the decades of research that the people who pass these laws are not doing so from an educated position of concern, but from a different position. What is that? I have a guess, but I can't say because they claim it's not about trans kids. Fuck. If you're listening to people talk about trans kids, we gotta talk about kids undergoing surgery at obscenely young ages. And you know what? That typically doesn't happen. I'm gonna say that it never happens? No. I'm sure there has been. I'm not sure it's ethical. But if you want to outlaw surgery on trans youth, then outlaw surgery on trans youth to those who are ages N and under. Not the psychological treatment and medication. But that's not the thing that happens most often. It's most often it's parents being told to treat the kids as if they are the gender that they say they are. That's it. That's the science. There's decades of research into it. No amount of cutesy named legislation is going to override that. And to borrow a phrase, the facts don't care about your feelings. So what would be a good argument? Joe Rogan says something about women who won during a cycling tourney, but that doesn't include the fact that she lost 3 times to the third place finisher before. Without context, Rogan's hypothetical cyclist is a man who one day decided to be a woman, hopped on a bike, and ran the race that day. And that's not like how it happened at all. If I could see people doing that, if there were people doing that, I could see that as an argument. And maybe it is an argument against those hypothetical people. But the vast majority of trans people are not that. And making laws against us because those bad actors is, well, fucking stupid. Before I go any further, I must say something that needs to be said. People won't read the research. They respect people who say things, so they believe the things. Of course, given that women's sports are not exactly a high-paying endeavor, just ask the WNBA, one would have to question why a guy would just blatantly do that and not expect consequences. And if you say cancel culture, you've lost the argument already. Try something new. Why do we have so many worries about the kids? One I hear most often is about opportunities for going to college, which tells me that these promising young cisgender girls will be out of an education because the trans kid takes their scholarship. She's cheating. Doesn't she deserve an education though too? But the kid's not cheating. She's just a better athlete than the cis kid. That's athletics, right? The cis kid should have worked harder. Like all those kids who lost to Michael Phelps when he was a swimmer in high school. But even further, why should any kid rely on athletic scholarships? Why is education limited thusly? Cool science and history lesson, Jen, but isn't this about sports? It is, but it isn't. It's about something far more insidious. This is quite clearly the edge case, the wedge issue. When I started preparing for this episode, I was kind of nervous. What if I did find some research that didn't support trans youth? That would suck. But the few things I did find along those lines were flawed science or from people who I knew to be untrustworthy. The problem is that trans women, like cis women, come in all sizes. Like trans men and cis men, they come in all sizes. Non-binary and everyone else too. We're all different sorts of people. But we're not people to those who would argue against trans youth or trans participation in sports. We're not people to them. We're the enemies. We're the thin edge of something. This is like those bathroom bills, you know? Those who have to present birth certificates to pee in the proper bathroom or whatever. It's going to hurt non-gender conforming cis people more than it will trans people because there's just less of us. We're just not that common. So it's not about sports, really. It's about not about trans people. It's about policing what's normal. It's no coincidence that one of the big conspiracy theories is that Michelle Obama is trans. She's not, but you better believe that these laws will be weaponized against black kids more than trans kids. Of course, trans kids are the target. They're the ones whose existence is being legislated, and believe me, that fucking feels bad, man. But there's a train coming against every other non-het-cis white kid in the entire fucking country. And even if that weren't the case, these kinds of laws don't make sense for kids and adults. Not philosophically, not ethically, and not scientifically. So I think I ought to leave it here. But I want to quote an actual cisgender female athlete, if I could, to close this out. I think that would put a nice bow on it. These bills are attempting to solve a problem that doesn't exist. Transgender kids want the opportunity to play sports for the same reason other kids do. To be a part of a team where they feel like they belong. Proponents of these bills argue they are protecting women. As a woman who has played sports my entire life, I know that the threats to women and girls sports are lack of funding, resources, and media coverage, sexual harassment, and unequal pay. That's Megan Rapinoe. Thanks for watching the News at Jen. Wednesday, I hope to be back with more snark. This is really kind of depressing. I really don't think kids like me should be targeted for legislation. I just read these laws and it's disgusting. If you only knew us. If you only knew just a couple trans people, this wouldn't even be an option.